All three of these cases happened during the final 10 years of my career. I'd spent a dozen years walking the beat before I finally got the chance to assist a detective and a CSI on a double murder case. Thanks to the many connections I'd built over my years on the street, we managed to track down several leads, which eventually led to the arrest of the perpetrators. From that point on, I left patrol duty behind and spent the next decade working major crimes, handling cases involving sexual assaults, arson, and armed robberies. I attended advanced seminars and training sessions, diving deep into past cases and criminal behavior patterns. Later, I worked alongside the narcotics unit on high-level assault cases and the occasional homicide. Eventually, I stepped in for a retiring detective. I already knew his partner, Jake Connolly, and we quickly became a solid team. I mention all of this for one reason, to make it clear that, during my 33 years in law enforcement, I witnessed some truly horrifying things. Sights that are burned into my memory. Faces that still visit me in my dreams. But I can tell you with full honesty, most of the people I locked up weren't what I'd call evil. They were driven by something, no matter how misguided or selfish, that pushed them toward their crimes. Then there's the gray area, the ones who take violence to a level that feels excessive, even for criminals. And then, there's the kind of person who seems to commit horrific acts just because they can. People who dream up monstrous things to unleash on the world for no other reason than that they want to. Patty Wilson was one of those. She didn't just cross the line. She lived on the far side of it. She was the first person I ever met who I could say, without hesitation, was truly evil. Patty had once worked as an RN, eventually transferring to a birthing clinic and OBGYN practice in one of the city's more impoverished neighborhoods. The clinic had a reputation, lots of miscarriages and stillbirths, but the official numbers were cooked, buried under bureaucratic smoke and mirrors. Over time, people in the neighborhood started to talk, and soon word got out about how many babies had died there. Eventually, someone contacted our precinct. Normally, a case like this would have landed on a different desk, but we were short-staffed, so Jake and I got assigned. Our investigation pointed us straight to Patty. We discovered that over her 23 years at the clinic, there had been more than 2,000 miscarriages. She'd been giving pregnant women a chemical mixture, claiming it would help them sleep. But in reality, it slowly killed their babies as they developed. Even more disturbing, when healthy births did happen, Patty would take the newborns away to clean them up, then return with tragic news. The baby had supposedly died shortly after delivery. We never found ironclad proof, but one thread we followed suggested that Patty had been lying, that the babies were alive and were instead being sold to the highest bidder. On the black market, a live infant could fetch a high price, whether for organs, stem cells, or even more depraved purposes. We started to believe that race played a role in it, too. Almost all of the mothers who suffered miscarriages or were told their baby had died were black. Patty, of course, denied everything. I'll never forget the first time we interviewed her. She answered our questions with what appeared to be genuine emotion. Her facial expressions shifted as she talked, but her eyes were another story. They were black, hollow, and utterly lifeless. The longer you looked into them, the more uncomfortable you felt. Even after the trial, where she was sentenced to multiple life terms, Patty maintained her innocence. The next time I encountered real evil, the case split into multiple, connected investigations. It started when Jake and I were called in to handle an attack that happened during a beach volleyball tournament. This wasn't just any game. It was a national-level event, held on the city's biggest beach, with over 300 teams playing on 50 courts over the weekend. The age range spanned from kids as young as 12 to seniors in their 60s. Both men and women competed. During the early warm-ups on the first morning, a single scream turned into a chain reaction. One became 2, then 5, then dozens. Before long, the beach was echoing with the cries of over 100 people. About a third of the athletes needed emergency medical care. Their legs, torsos, and in some cases even their faces, were shredded with deep, bleeding cuts. We soon discovered that someone had buried hundreds of wooden platforms beneath the sand the night before. Each piece had a razor blade embedded in the center, standing upright like an upside-down T. They were buried just below the surface, out of sight but perfectly positioned to slice anyone who stepped or dove onto the sand. Setting all that up must have taken hours. Miraculously, no one died, but the injuries were catastrophic. Dozens of young athletes suffered sliced Achilles tendons and career-threatening damage. As always, we started at the scene and worked outward in tight, calculated circles. While forensics teams combed the beach, Jake and I began interviewing organizers and staff, trying to find someone with a grudge against the tournament or its management. But we came up empty. Forensics didn't get us anywhere either. There were too many footprints and shoe prints mixed into the sand, making it impossible to track. Worse yet, the razor traps had been soaked in bleach before being placed, erasing any possible DNA. The beach didn't have security cameras, and the only one in the nearby parking lot hadn't recorded a single car between midnight and 7 a.m. Leads came in fast, flooding our phones, but none of them went anywhere. After a month of dead ends, the case went cold. Then a new case dropped, tightening our already stretched department further. Jake and I were assigned to this one too. This time, it was an arson at a retirement home on the city's waterfront. The fire had started in the basement, and due to accelerants, it tore through the first 2 floors in minutes. The flames eventually consumed the entire 8-story building. 22 residents and 9 staff members lost their lives, most from smoke inhalation. We reviewed every frame of the surviving security footage, but, again, no suspects appeared near the entrances or parking areas. The footage from the back of the building had been destroyed in the fire. Just as we were digging into that case, a third incident landed on our desks. This time, it was a mass poisoning at a junior high school. The cafeteria was hit, and the results were devastating. 23 people died, 15 of them students. More than 100 others were hospitalized with severe symptoms. Our investigation revealed that someone had broken into the school during the night and poisoned every food item in the kitchen. Freezers, fridges, dry stock, everything had been laced with arsenic. It was a miracle the death toll wasn't higher. The school's security cameras were functional, and we managed to catch a break with one mounted near the back entrance. The footage showed a figure dressed completely in black, wearing a hoodie and ski mask. He used lock-picking tools to get inside and exited the same way, disappearing across the soccer field toward the waterfront. And that's when the pieces started coming together. The beach, the senior home, the school, they all shared one thing in common. They were right along the water. The junior high had even embraced it, offering aquatic programs like rowing, kayaking, and sailing. The retirement home boasted its scenic ocean views in all its promotional material. We formed a new theory. The same person was behind all 3 mass attacks. We pinned the 3 locations on a map and followed the coastline, checking every marina and harbor. Then we pulled security footage from any coastal site we knew had exterior cameras. We narrowed our search to the nights each crime took place and started hunting for any boats that showed up at multiple scenes. Hours of footage later, we had one match. It was an old, black speedboat. A single figure was always at the wheel, and we couldn't get a clear image of their face. Inside the boat's cabin, a dim red light glowed eerie, ominous. We printed stills of the boat and started canvassing the marinas. No one recognized it. No records showed it had ever docked at any official harbor. That led us to believe it was tied up at a private residence. I called in a favor from an old friend in narcotics, Brian Waco Jensen. He'd been monitoring a growing drug scene in a nearby cove. The new trend? Drug users were leaving alleyways and abandoned buildings for small boats, creating floating dens of addiction. According to Waco, these boats were difficult to raid and even harder to monitor. You could float in that channel for 6 months without being forced to leave, though the rule was never enforced and more boats kept showing up. Waco agreed to check it out for us. That night, he made his way through the 30 or so boats anchored there, and he found it, the black speedboat. Locals called the owner Red. He was a dealer who let users get high on board and pass out in the cabin. Waco returned the next night. This time we were ready. He wore a wire and Jake and I followed at a safe distance in a Coast Guard boat, all lights off, fully stealth. Waco blended in with a group of users looking to score heroin. He faked shooting up and pretended to nod off with the others. Jake and I listened in. Casual chatter from the other users filtered through our earpieces. Then silence. A new voice, rough, twitchy, cut through the quiet. "Anyone still awake?" No response. Red chuckled. "Good." We heard shuffling, then the roar of the engine. The boat took off, speeding out of the cove. Waco had a GPS tracker hidden in his shoe. We watched the signal glide across the water as the Coast Guard silently pursued. After several minutes, the engine died. Then we heard the unmistakable sound of metal links clanking, chains being moved. Waco whispered into the mic, his voice low and urgent. "He's chaining us together. There's an anchor on one end." Our captain flipped on the lights and sirens. The Coast Guard boat surged toward Red's vessel. Over the wire, we heard Red panic. According to Waco, he was about to throw the anchor overboard. But Waco wasn't really out. He jumped Red from behind, locking him in a chokehold. By the time we boarded, Red was out cold on the floor, and Waco was kneeling on his back. 5 other users lay lifeless on the deck. They'd been given tainted doses. All of them were already dead. Back on land, we brought Red in for questioning, but any hope of getting answers from him died fast. And not just figuratively. He bit off his own tongue before we even got him into the interview room. He spent a day and a half recovering in the hospital before we finally sat him down with a pencil and paper. But even then, he refused to communicate. Nothing. Not a word. Just silence. Not that it mattered. We had more than enough evidence to put him away for the deaths of the 5 users on the boat. Then divers began recovering bodies from the same stretch of coastline where Red's boat had been spotted. By the time the full scope of the investigation became clear, Red was tied to over 50 deaths. And that didn't even include the beach incident, the senior home fire, or the school poisoning. But there's one thing I'll never forget from those interviews, the same thing that haunted me after Patty Wilson. It was Red's eyes. While his face twitched and moved as he reacted to us, his eyes remained completely still, completely empty. They looked like black holes just like Patty's, unblinking, lifeless voids that seemed to stare through you. We never got a motive. Digging into his background only turned up more questions. He'd been shuffled between foster homes until the age of 16. On his 16th birthday, one of the homes caught fire. His foster parents and 2 other kids died in the blaze. After that, Red vanished from all records for years. He resurfaced after being arrested for assault in a movie theater and spent the next decade bouncing in and out of prison. God only knows what kind of destruction he caused in the years we lost track of him. My third and final brush with pure evil came just as Jake was approaching retirement. Fittingly, it was our last case together. We were assigned to investigate a series of disappearances, 6 white women, all between the ages of 18 and 22. Their profiles didn't match the typical grooming gang targets, and we ruled out human trafficking early on. We ran through endless interviews with friends, roommates, co-workers. Everyone had alibis. No one contradicted earlier statements. We had 0 persons of interest. There was, however, one common thread. Each of the missing women had been part of the same underground punk and heavy metal circles. They all shared an interest in satanic iconography and fringe occult material. Jake and I started going back through event records, looking for connections, when we found something strange. Each woman had attended a local death metal show on the night she vanished. They all had tickets for the same opening act, a Norwegian black metal band called Helvete. The band had a reputation. On stage, they wore grotesque masks and smeared themselves with what looked like blood. Each mask was uniquely shaped but followed the same theme. Facial outlines textured like rotting skin, and bundles of black twigs sticking out from the back like quills on a porcupine. The more we read about them, the more uneasy we became. They weren't just weird, they were off. Dangerous. We tracked down an address, someplace way out on the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods and open land. We parked in their long driveway just as the sun was setting. The house sat like a shadow against the orange and blue sky, an old farmhouse with sagging shutters and rotting siding. From inside, we could hear the pounding of metal music. The bass thudded through the walls. A large black van was parked out back. 2 old sedans sat in the front. As we approached the door, a blood-curdling scream tore through the music. Jake drew his .38. I pulled my 9mm. We called in backup and pushed inside. The front door was unlocked. Just past the foyer, a staircase curved up and to the right. Down the left hallway, we could make out the living room, dining room, and kitchen. Another scream, then chanting. It was coming from beneath us. We found a door to the basement and opened it. Jake led the way down the stairs, his gun raised. Just as he reached the last step, someone was waiting for him. A giant, well over 6 feet, wearing a filthy mechanic's jumpsuit and one of those horrifying twig masks, came swinging at Jake with a hatchet. Jake managed to fire off a round as the blade came down. The shot exploded in the basement, deafening me. My ears rang violently. My balance staggered. When my vision refocused, I saw Jake had been hit. The hatchet was lodged in his neck. But even as he collapsed, he kept firing at shadows in the far corner of the room. I pushed forward, gun raised, heart racing. The basement was a maze. White sheets hung from the ceiling, swaying like ghosts and blocking my line of sight. The music pounded louder. The chanting grew frantic. The screaming had stopped. I wanted to get to Jake, but I had to clear the room first. Stepping over the body of the masked man Jake had shot, I followed the chanting through the sheets until I found the source. The far room opened into a makeshift ritual chamber. Red candles flickered along every wall. A large circle had been painted on the concrete floor, and inside it, an inverted pentagram, smeared in what looked like blood. In the far corner, the floor turned to dirt. Several graves had been dug there, each one crudely filled in. At the center of the pentagram lay a young woman, barely clothed, her wrists and ankles chained to pegs in the ground. She had just given birth. The remains of 5 infants, each freshly delivered and lifeless, lay at the points of the pentagram around her. Kneeling before her was another band member, smaller than the first, cradling a crying newborn. His mask twitched as he chanted. 2 more figures flanked him, one holding a massive blood-stained sledgehammer, the other reading from a thick, leather-bound book. All of them looked up when I stepped in. The one with the hammer moved first, lifting it over his head. I fired 2 rounds into his chest before turning to the man with the book. He lunged, throwing the tome at me and tackling me to the ground. We hit the concrete hard. My head slammed back and the world turned into a blur of ringing and shadows. I blinked rapidly, trying to stay awake, trying to process what was happening. The third man, the one who'd been holding the newborn, had gently placed it at the center of the pentagram. Then he grabbed the sledgehammer from his fallen friend and raised it high, ready to bring it down. I didn't even realize I was still holding my gun. On instinct, I pulled the trigger again and again until it clicked dry. The final shot struck him in the head just as he was about to swing. He toppled backward. The hammer hit the floor harmless, and then everything went dark. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital. My head was bandaged, my hearing was still patchy, and my body ached from the fall. A nurse stood beside me. She looked relieved. Then the memories came flooding back. Jake, the basement, the hammer, the baby. A detective I didn't recognize came in and told me what had happened after I blacked out. Backup arrived minutes after my last transmission. They'd stormed the farmhouse, guns drawn. All the remaining members of Helvete were dead. Jake didn't make it. The young woman and the newborn both survived. Somehow, the rest of the case was taken over by 2 new detectives from homicide, and they dug deep. What they uncovered chilled me to my core. Helvete had been abducting women from shows they played, keeping them hidden in the farmhouse basement. The goal was to impregnate them, then use their babies in some twisted mass ritual sacrifice. Once all 6 had given birth, they planned to slaughter the infants together in an offering to the devil. Some kind of unholy contract. A Faustian deal, they believed, would bring them power, fame, or something even darker. The 5 previous women had all died after childbirth, killed and buried in the dirt at the far end of the basement. Only the last woman had lived long enough to be rescued. What haunted me most was knowing how close they came to finishing the ritual. 1 second later with that hammer, and that final baby would have been dead. And maybe something else would have crossed over. Now, officially, I logged all the relevant details in my final report. Every name, date, and step of the investigation. Everything that could be proven. But there was one thing I left out. One detail I never wrote down. It's the real reason I retired the next day, without warning. Why I never looked back. I saw something down in that basement. Something that wasn't human. When I first entered the ritual room and aimed my gun at the 3 men, it wasn't just them standing inside that circle. Floating at the center, hovering above the pentagram, was a shape. It looked like smoke at first. A dark, twisting cloud, almost liquid in the way it moved. But it never dispersed. It held its form, pulsing, stretching, shrinking, then expanding again. And inside that black cloud, flashes of red lightning crackled. Fast, silent streaks like veins sparking to life. The more the chanting grew, the bigger it became. It shifted from formless to vaguely human, like a silhouette, tall and wide, but not quite solid. It began to reach outward, like it was trying to push through, like it was almost there. When the chanting stopped, the smoke froze. It trembled in place. And then, as the final cultist died, it began to shrink again, slowly collapsing in on itself. I haven't told anyone that part. Not my captain, not the psychologists, not even my wife. But I've seen it every night since. And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I'd missed that final shot. If the hammer had dropped and the baby had died. What would have stepped out of that smoke? I've gone over that night more times than I can count. I've replayed every movement, every decision. I've tried to rationalize what I saw in that basement. Told myself it was a hallucination, maybe from the head trauma or the adrenaline. But it wasn't. It was real. That thing, whatever it was real. I've seen a lot during my 33 years in law enforcement. Some of it you get used to. You build up emotional calluses over time. You learn how to compartmentalize. But there are a few things that stay with you. Patricia Wilson's hollow, black eyes. Red's lifeless stare as he floated through life like a shadow. And whatever it was I saw floating above that pentagram, watching, Waiting. I believe there are different kinds of evil in this world. Some people kill for money, for revenge, for twisted pleasure. Others kill for ideology, out of desperation, out of fear. But then there's a deeper evil. A kind that doesn't want anything. That doesn't need a reason. It just is. Patty killed slowly, methodically, over years. She disguised her evil behind compassion and white coats. Her crimes were clinical, cold, and almost invisible. Red was chaos. His evil was like a virus, spreading and infecting everything it touched. He didn't hide it, he just didn't care. And Helvete, they wanted to be evil. They chased it. They worshipped it. And I think, in the end, something heard them. That's what haunts me most. The idea that true evil isn't just in people, that it might be out there, lurking, feeding off human acts like fuel. That night, we stopped something from coming through. But what if someone else tries again? What if one day someone succeeds? I've left the force now, moved out of the city. I don't read the news anymore. I don't answer calls from my old precinct. I spend my time quietly trying to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I hear things, low murmurs in the silence, like chanting just beyond the walls. And sometimes, I see flickers of black in the corners of my vision, just for a second, like smoke folding in on itself. And every now and then, when I close my eyes, I remember how the air felt in that basement. Heavy, electric, like something was just about to arrive. And all it needed